From our perspective, it doesn't matter how someone talks about this. They can talk about it as sexual compulsivity, sexual addiction. In the therapeutic community, it's referred to as unwanted sexual behavior. If they
Right.
come from a faith tradition, they may refer to this as a lust problem or a sin problem. It really doesn't matter what language they use, as long as the language that they use encourages them to take it seriously and also to understand the complexity. A lot of times we want to offer a simple solution to a complex issue, and in doing that, we just look foolish. So
I
there
see.
needs to be this acknowledge of the complexity, and also we can have a tendency to minimize it, either the behaviors or the actions or the consequences. And what we know is until we take an issue seriously, we're not going to put our full efforts towards this, and our full efforts are necessary in order to get free.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. On today's program, we're going to feature part one of a two-part series featuring Dr. Greg Miller. Greg was asked to take part in a series called Porn Resilient Summit that took place in late 2023. The tagline of this event was "The Pilgrimage from Unwanted Porn Use to Fearless Sexuality." Greg's portion is called Principles of Porn Addiction Recovery. Here is part one of Dr. Greg Miller with Taylor Chambers on the principles of porn addiction.
Hey, everybody. This is Taylor Chambers. I'm really happy to be here with Greg Miller. Greg, thank you for showing up and taking part in this event. I know it's going to be a really high impact event for a lot of people. So
Thanks for including me.
Well, Greg, you are a pretty well-known figure in a pretty well-known organization within this kind of world of support for those who are going through sexual concerns, particularly pornography addiction or sex addiction more broadly. So you're a member of Faithful and True, which is an organization that provides a lot of resources and courses and counseling and things like that. And part of what you do in particular is leading intensive workshops for men and workshops for couples as part of their work, and kind of getting some of the education and some of those initial experiences to move them forward on the path of recovery. And then you are the host of the Faithful and True podcast as well. So anything else? Do you keep books, or do you
No, that pretty much sums it up.
Yeah.
And one thing
that's
that
awesome.
I say is we also work with spouses. So as you mentioned, we do workshops for men who struggle, and we work with women who are in relationships with men who struggle, and we also work with couples.
That's right. Yeah. Kind of all sides of that picture. So, yeah. All right. Well, let's see. So I want to jump in because when we were talking a little while ago and getting to know each other, seeing if this was going to make sense to connect through this event, you shared a bit about your approach to helping individuals work through these matters. And I just thought it was golden. And so I'm kind of, in some ways, the ask was like, hey, could you just say that in the interview? You know what I mean? And so we'll jump into that. But I guess I want to kind of just ask that first question of like, let's kind of get some of the context of like, what is it that, how are we understanding sexual addiction? How is it that we're understanding the pathway toward healing and recovery? Kind of what do you see as some of the big picture stuff? And then we'll kind of get into some of the principles that you operate from.
Okay. Well, one of the things, as the director of the men's workshop, I always get the question, who's the workshop for? And that's probably a good place to start. We work with men who, because of the choices they've made in the area of sexuality, they've hurt themselves and others, they've created chaos for themselves and others, and on their own, they've been unable to stop. And I think that for a lot of people, they have difficulty identifying if they really have a struggle because they're wanting to look at the behavior and not necessarily look at the consequences of their behavior. But if someone is making choices in the area of sexuality and they're hurting themselves and others, they're creating chaos for themselves and others, that probably is something that they need to pay attention to. And then the second part of that is, and on their own, they've been unable to stop.
I see.
That's what kind of transitions it into just a difficult behavior into probably having some addiction energy or some compulsive energy behind it.
Yeah, right. So there's been problems associated with their sexuality, and their efforts to mitigate those problems or turn things around just haven't been sufficient.
Right. And the other thing, kind of the way we talk about, and I'll say this, from our perspective, it doesn't matter how someone talks about this. They can talk about it as sexual compulsivity, sexual addiction. In the therapeutic community, it's referred to as unwanted sexual behavior. If they come from a faith tradition, they may refer to this as a lust problem or a sin problem. It really doesn't matter what language they use, as long as the language that they use encourages them to take it seriously and also to understand the complexity. A lot of times we want to offer a simple solution to a complex issue, and in doing that, we just look foolish. So there needs to be this acknowledge of the complexity, and also we can have a tendency to minimize it, either the behaviors or the actions or the consequences. And what we know is until we take an issue seriously, we're not going to put our full efforts towards this, and our full efforts are necessary in order to get free.
Yeah. So kind of the whatever language supports the let's take it seriously and let's acknowledge that this is a complex thing. There's a lot of pieces involved in this.
Yeah. Well, with that said, kind of our definition of addiction occurs anytime we're trying to meet a legitimate need in an illegitimate way in a repetitive pattern. And recovery is when I identify what the legitimate need is, and I begin to meet that need in a legitimate way. And one of the questions Mark Laaser, the founder of Faithful and True, used to ask is, when did sexual arousal become the solution to your problems? For those who are compulsively using pornography or some other sexual behavior, for many of them, it is an attempt to meet some legitimate need that somewhere in their story became sexualized. Therefore, they keep going back thinking this is going to satisfy them. And what most experiences, at the end of the experience, they feel very dissatisfied.
Yeah. I love that breakdown. It really keeps it very clear. This is centering on needs, and it kind of honors the fact that problematic behavior stems from a very genuine place, those legitimate needs, as you described. And a lot of times I'll kind of refer to them as like, there's a noble intention behind this part of you that's trying to show up, right? It's trying to do something useful. But as you say, sometimes we adopt strategies. Ineffective strategies is the term I use, and then illegitimate, or illegitimate strategies to meet the needs.
Illegitimate attempt to meet a legitimate need.
There it is. Yeah. Which is so well put. I mean, I think it makes it very clear that, herein lies the problem and here's the solution. And then we can start digging into the nuance and detail from there, but it gives that very clear overview.
Right. And one of the things that we see is, at some point, typically when someone is in childhood, sexuality comes into their life way before they're able to navigate the significance and the complexity and the ramifications of sexuality. And so here they are, a young child, trying to engage this thing that has so much significance and power, and they just get pulled into it way before they're able to navigate it. And one of the things that we want people to understand is, whatever that early exposure to sexuality was, without the proper support to know how to move through it, they get stuck in it. And that begins that repetitive pattern that we keep talking about.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So those are kind of ways of organizing, like this is, who we tend to work with and the type of work that we tend to do. Anything else with that context, or should we jump kind of into those ideas, those principles that you've mentioned?
One other thing I would add is that for a lot of people, what they struggle with is knowing how to engage the significance of their acting out, because maybe it's not consistent. A lot of the men that we work with may go a month, 2 months, 6 months, and not act out in any way sexually. And so what happens is they tell themselves, well, it's not that big of a problem. So again,
Mm-hmm.
it's not just looking at the problematic behavior, it's also looking at that intention that is driving it. And I often say, if all you're trying to do is stop a behavior, it's like mowing your grass thinking you're going to get rid of the weeds. It
Mm-hmm.
doesn't work. And for a while, it looks good because anything that's green and short looks good. But if I'm
Mm-hmm.
trying to get rid of the weeds, that doesn't happen until I start dealing with the roots. And so for
Mm-hmm.
those listeners who might be minimizing their behavior because maybe they don't do it that often, or they really haven't experienced a lot of significant consequences, and there's not been a lot of disruption, we want them to understand that really the telling factor is that repetitive nature of it and that idea of being stuck in a cycle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. These are patterns that can, for some, remain dormant for quite a while.
Right.
And in many ways, yeah, I mean that's a pretty natural place to just coast in life.
Right.
And yet it's also one of the spaces in our lives where we can do the most growth work, is when we are freed up to focus on either the deeper things or the more difficult things or the more advanced things, rather than just trying to manage that chaos and get back to baseline in the first place.
Right. I'm going to use another landscaping image, even though I'm not really into lawn care. So at one point we owned a house that had this beautiful front yard, not because of me, we inherited the beautiful front yard.
Yeah.
And we had to get some plumbing work done. And so they came in and they dug a trench and they had to put in a pipe. And then they
Mm-hmm.
put the soil back on top of it. And what happened was where they had dug the trench, all that grew there were weeds. So I was talking to someone who did understand landscaping, and I was just asking, why is that the case? And what the landscaper said is what was happening was in that soil, there were these seeds that were dormant. And when they turned the soil over, it awakened the seeds, and what grew were the weeds.
Mm.
Well, I work with a lot of men, and that's kind of their story. There was this sense of it being dormant, that there wasn't a lot of activity, and then there was some sort of life experience that turned over their soil, created chaos, exposed the legitimate need, and then they found themselves falling back into some old patterns. I
Mm.
think for older men, part of that was the development of the internet. Again, we work
Sure.
with a lot of men 50 years old and older that would say for most of their life, it really wasn't problematic. They could look and see where consistently they might fall back to pornography, but it wasn't that often. But once the internet came along, the accessibility of it is what awakened that seed. And then they
Mm-hmm.
began to really understand the significance of what was going under the soil and underneath the surface.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's a beautiful image, and it invites our reflection on, so what is that legitimate need? Like, what just got turned over here that needs to be looked at?
Right,
So
absolutely.
yeah, yeah. Well, very cool. So now, you help orient people by kind of grounding them in some principles about what this is all about. And so, would you mind sharing those principles as a way of orienting
Absolutely.
us as well?
So the first one that we teach is sex addiction is not about sex, it's about how you use sex.
Okay.
And it's important, we're back to that legitimate need, that it's important that
Yeah.
we understand what is that legitimate need. An image that I would share is, let's say I'm a little boy or a little girl, because this is true for women also, and I'm
Yeah.
just overwhelmed by life. And life is hard when you're a little boy. You know, you go to school and you have to sit still. You go to the playground, you
Hmm.
don't know if you're going to be picked for the team. You go to the cafeteria, you don't know what table to sit at. And then maybe you come home and there's disruption in your family. Maybe there's arguing and coldness or whatever. So I'm a
Yeah.
little boy. I lay down in bed at night. And what I discover, if I just hold my penis, I start to feel better. Because of
Mm.
the release of neurochemicals, just the touching of myself creates this sense of well being. And then
Mm.
what I discover, if I massage my penis or stroke my penis, eventually I'll get an erection and I have this sense of empowerment. And then if I'm old enough and I've gone through puberty, then I can masturbate to the place of orgasm and ejaculation. And
Mm.
that experience is so significantly powerful neurochemically that I relax and I fall asleep. So here I'm a little boy exposed to this experience, and suddenly I begin to use it to try to meet some of my legitimate needs. It's now become my anxiety medication, it's
Mm.
become my pain reliever, it's become my sleep aid. And so what
Mhm.
happens is the next time I feel anxious or lonely or insecure, I remember masturbation. The next time I can't fall asleep, I remember masturbation. And the next
Mm-hmm.
time I'm feeling anxiety, I remember masturbation. And so suddenly it's no longer about engaging in some sort of sexual experience. It's how I'm using the sexuality. So the first thing is sex addiction is not about sex. It's about how I'm using sex. What am I wanting to get from that? And in
Mm-hmm.
doing that, it can be how I express sexuality by myself. It can also be how I express it with my partner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's taking a look at, what is the function of this behavior? Because it's doing something, if it's repeated and stubborn and resistant to efforts to, redirect the behavior, then it must be serving some function. And,
Right.
and again, therein lies the investigation of those legitimate needs.
Right. Well,
So,
and
and now,
part of the
well, go ahead.
complexity is it actually temporarily seems to meet the need.
Yeah.
See, I often say if it was a complete lie, we could easily see that. But
Mm-hmm.
in the acting out behavior, there's a half truth. So
Mm.
temporarily, I do feel comforted. Temporarily, I do feel safe. Temporarily, I can relax and fall asleep. It's just that it's not sustainable and it comes at a great cost. I
Mm-hmm.
often talk about addiction is an attempt to buy something on credit with significant interest rates. Because
Mm.
it temporarily and quickly I get it, but the back end cost is significant, and that's part of what creates the chaos.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Now, you already mentioned some, but what are some of the legitimate needs that are most frequently associated with this kind of behavior? I mean, you
Uh,
mentioned stress and
Right.
kind of overwhelm from the world.
I think we can kind of go to those core things where we were created to be connected in relationship. And so
Mm-hmm.
there is this sense of connection, being chosen, being included, being affirmed. Our founder and his wife, Mark and Deb Laaser, wrote a book, The Seven Desires. And I really love that book because it reminds us of some of these core things that each of us desire. And one of them would be connection. So it's to be
Mm-hmm.
included, to be affirmed, to be chosen. And so if I begin to sexualize that, what I begin to believe is when I'm chosen sexually, that's the best way to get chosen or the only way to get chosen or to be
Uh-huh.
included sexually. If I'm affirmed sexually, then that's the best way to do it.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that we all desperately need is safety. And
Mm-hmm.
so anxiety and fear are basically telling us that there's something in our life that we don't perceive that we're safe. We're afraid we're going to be rejected. We're afraid we're going to be overwhelmed and controlled. And so through the acting out, I can begin to create this sense of safety. I often say fear and anxiety are like warning lights on the dashboard that's telling us that we perceive ourselves as unsafe. So it's
Yeah.
not about ignoring the warning lights, it's about investigating the warning lights. And
Mm-hmm.
part of safety is I don't believe or perceive that there's a threat. I often talk to men and say that for many of them, porn and masturbation is like their panic room. If there's a threat, if there's something in their life that they don't feel like they're safe, maybe they are experiencing rejection or judgment, maybe they do feel like they're going to be crushed by power, then they retreat to their porn, their masturbation, create a panic room in order to be safe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Well put. I love the metaphors. They really help kind of evoke like, well, yeah, that's kind of a place that we go to for that sake of safety. So um now I've heard you say as well, sex addiction chooses you, and at some point you choose it back. What do you mean by that phrase? That's a
Well,
very
that's
interesting way of putting it.
Yeah, that's one of our principles, and that is early on, sex addiction chooses you, and then at some point, you choose it back.
Hmm.
And what I mean by that is when we are children, at some point, we were introduced to something sexual. Maybe it was an image, maybe it was a website, maybe it was a video or a DVD that we came across, or maybe it was experimenting with other children. And then
Hmm.
what happens is when we are introduced to something sexual as children, there are two things that happen. The first thing is we become curious, and that makes sense. There's nothing wrong with curiosity. In fact, curiosity is essential for living the full, abundant life because curiosity invites me to go beyond that which I understand.
Hmm.
So, curiosity is what gives a bigness and fullness to our life. And so,
Yeah.
what happens is I'm introduced to something sexual. I become curious about it, and that curiosity causes me to want to explore it. If I'm a little boy and I'm introduced to bugs, I become curious about bugs. If I'm introduced to the stars, I become curious about astronomy. So it makes sense. If I'm introduced to something sexual, I become curious about sexuality. And one of the mistakes a lot of people make is they assume that curiosity is the same as desire. So as a little boy, I didn't have a lot of sexual desire. I hadn't developed yet. I didn't have necessarily the hormones and the neurochemistry associated with sexuality. So what I had was curiosity. But what also happens if I'm introduced to something like sexuality, I can also develop shame. And so shame is that part of the adventure or the experience that sends us into hiding. One of the ways I can know my shame is triggered is I want to hide. I don't want anybody to see me. I often say our shame gets triggered when we know we're being seen, and our fear is that someone is going to see us the way we see ourselves. So if I'm a little boy and I've stumbled across a website, or I found a magazine, or I was experimenting with my brother or my sister or my cousin, I shut the door. I turn off the screen. I hide the image because intuitively I don't want to be seen because my fear is I'm doing something wrong. Now, here's what's complicated, I think, is that what happens for a child is when they are exposed to pornography, they intuitively know that something is off. They know that something is wrong about this. But the problem is, if I'm a child, I haven't developed my differentiated self yet. And so because I cannot separate myself from my experiences or from other people, the message that I get is, I am wrong. And so that's the original shame message. There's something wrong with me. So I am my environment. I am my experiences. I am other people's reactions. So if I'm exposed to pornography, if I had a differentiated self, I would say pornography is wrong. I am okay. But if I don't have that differentiated self, I go, I am wrong because I am this experience. I am the pornography because I can't separate myself. And that is the origin of the shame. The intuition, the prompting is accurate. There is something wrong with a child being exposed to pornography. A child doesn't have the capacity to navigate that well. The child will become consumed and unable to navigate all the energy and the chaos that is creating. So yes, a child being exposed to pornography is wrong, and the child is not wrong. That's part of the help that we want to do in differentiating the experience of the child from the person of the child.
Yeah. A lot of times we can look back and, some of us carry that same frustration and blame of the child version of ourselves. And some of us can see ourselves with that compassion.
Yeah. Well,
therein lies some of the help.
We actually encourage men to forgive that child part of them that found the pornography. I often say, have grace with that part of you that was first exposed to pornography or whatever it was sexually. And one of my images for addiction is like the Death Star. So for anyone who's familiar with Star Wars, in the original one, there was the Death Star. It was this huge machine that could destroy a planet. And there's this scene where Han Solo gets too close to the Death Star and the Millennium Falcon gets stuck in the tractor beam. Well, addiction is the Death Star, and the power that it has over us is that tractor beam that pulls us in. And once we get too close to it, then we lose our power. One of the principles of addiction, that first step is I am powerless over whatever it is, fill in the blank, my addictive behavior. And so what I often say is, yes, we are powerless in our addiction and we are powerful in our recovery. And so if we get too close to the Death Star, we do lose control of the ship. Well, if I'm a child and the Death Star comes into my life, it makes perfect sense that the tractor beam is too powerful for me.
Right.
So that's where, the first part of this is early on sex addiction chose me. When sexuality in this unhealthy way came into my life, it chose me. The second part of the equation, though, is, and I chose it back. At some point, I began to use it as my anxiety medication. I began to use it as my pain reliever. And I often say that all fantasies are a rescue fantasy. If you're fantasizing, you want to be rescued from something and you want to be rescued to something. As soon as I began to want to escape and I began to use behaviors or thoughts as ways to escape, I need to take responsibility for that. And one of the ways I do that is I focus on that part of my life that I want to escape from, and I seek to find the resources and the agency to address those issues rather than simply escape from them. And so that's the piece. Early on, it chose me, and I'm going to have grace with that part of me that it chose. And I'm also going to take responsibility for the various ways I've chosen it back.
Yeah, right. It's a good distinction because it allows for some of that self-forgiveness without minimizing or without shunting responsibility for, doing what it takes to put it back on course.
Right. But it also, I think, acknowledges the power of addiction.
Mm-hmm.
The nature of the Death Star is if I get too close to it, I do lose my power. So therefore, part of my agency is to stay away from the Death Star. That's part of that response where I'm going to acknowledge my weaknesses, my limitations, and be able to create a strategy that actually acknowledges them so that I can live in more freedom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can use that freedom to put yourself into positions where you don't feel that magnetic pull or that tractor beam. Yeah.
And I find those things that actually help me have capacity to say no to the Death Star. Again, if I get too close, it makes sense I'm powerless. But if I'm using my community, if I'm using my other resources to stay further away from the Death Star, that's when I begin to experience freedom from the addiction.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, man, you drew out a lot of nostalgia for me. I'm replaying those scenes in my mind, and yeah, I love that analogy. If we can forgive.
One more principle that I want to share, and that is,
please.
Sex addiction is powerful because it's driven by a legitimate need.
Yeah.
I often tell people it's not that you are weak, it's that this is strong. And what makes it strong is that legitimate need. And the rest of that is, and the legitimate need is not for more sex. One of the mistakes that we make is I'm going to be able to address this issue simply by becoming more sexual. But for the addict, no matter how much I do the behavior, it's not going to satisfy me because that legitimate need continues to go unmet. It's like telling the alcoholic, well, you just drink more. And at some point, you're going to satisfy your desire for alcohol. But that's not going to work because there's something else that's driving it. And so we got to get in there and figure out what else is driving it.
Yeah.
One of my favorite definitions of lust is the thirsty person craving salt. And I modified that to say lust is the thirsty person drinking salt water. If I'm living in the addiction, I'm drinking salt water thinking it's going to satisfy me. But not only does it not satisfy me, it actually makes me thirstier.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, and it's a familiar, or it reminds me of kind of the Buddhist realm of hungry ghosts. And there's a book by that title which takes advantage of that Buddhist metaphor. But yeah, it highlights that there are things that we keep consuming as if it would fill us, as if it would do something for us, and yet it never does. The imagery in the Buddhist mythology is one of beings with large stomachs and very thin necks, and so they can never be fully filled in that way. But yeah, I mean, we're trying to quench our thirst with salt water. I think that's exactly what's going on.
Well, thank you for joining us today for part one of a two-part series featuring Dr. Greg Miller. Greg's appearance with Taylor Chambers was all part of the Porn Resilience Summit that took place in late 2023. We'll be following that up with part two of that same series, and that will be coming to you very shortly. We'd like to thank you for joining our podcast again today, and want to just thank you for all of your loyal listener and viewership for the Faithful and True podcasts. We'd like to remind you that if these podcasts are opening your eyes to your need to reach out for help from Faithful and True, we invite you to do that. Visit our website at faithfulandtrue.com, where you'll find lots of resources to help you as you fight your struggle with sex addiction. We also want to make you aware of our 3-day intensive workshops: the Men's Journey Workshop, the Spouses, the female version, which is the Women's Journey Workshops, and then we also have the Couples Journey Workshops. All 3 of these events are available at faithfulandtrue.com. So until we join you again next time, may the coming week be a week for you that's filled with many blessings and with great vision.